Nathan L. Stand. You've threatened collegial murder in the pond of woes hollow. For this, there can be no penalty, but immediate and permanent dismissal. There shall be no formal valediction, catered or otherwise. Your outing will be notified forthwith.
I accept. It is true.
Please refrain from any further speech.
It is a worthy sacrifice.
As you are no longer authorized to consort with any severed employee, nor they with you.
Yeah, the season 2 of Severance has really just cranked up. Great episodes.
It's big. Yeah, you and I actually haven't discussed that show before, I don't think. But yes, I'm a big fan.
Definitely why there's less content coming out, you know. You gotta watch the shows. Apple TV's been on a good streak. Shrinking season 2, also very good. I think we have more substantive matters to discuss. Tom has been working on stuff it's not really, saying in the background doesn't do it justice. Tom has been building something, and as most startups are, they're stealth, and I'm curious to learn more about the fleshed out and full detailed version. I understand the motivations, and any longtime listener also will understand kind of what brought us to the table to start this. There are things that are different in the space of AI now, so some of our core motivations for starting the Retort are not the biggest issues facing AI, but there's facsimiles of them that really are, and I'm guessing you want to explain more of this, and we can kind of roll into it on this episode of, what is it, the Retort AI podcast, or we could call it many things, and it'll be a good one.
It's exciting. It's an exciting time for the company. Yeah, this is something I've been working on for a while, in stealth, as you mentioned, and we're just now leaving, and we're going to be announcing some partnerships, some collaborations, some pilots. There's a white paper that we have that's, I think by the time this episode goes live, will be fully out there with co-signers added to it. And it felt natural to discuss it here as well, because so much of the vision for the company relates not only to the themes of our previous conversations on this podcast, but conversations and topics that Nate and I have been circling and discussing. I mean, yeah, since like we were both in grad school together at Berkeley. And a lot of it also does grow out of, you know, my previous work with the political economy of RL conversations and NeurIPS workshop that we did, Pearls for short. Basically, you know, we're in a moment, especially now, where everyone is, including developers in these companies, deeply anxious and insecure about where this technology is, where it's going, where it could go, whether or not it's a science, what that would even mean if it was a science. And basically, I've used this metaphor before of the fence post turtle. We had a previous episode where I was telling that story about, you know, I think a lot of folks who end up being technical program managers, or, you know, even at the managerial level, CIOs, CTOs, who are tasked with making workflows AI driven. What does it mean to integrate an agent? What does it mean to actually onboard generative AI in ways that are organizationally coherent, let alone good? These mandates are often just not met with KPIs that are, you know, up to the task, frankly. When you're doing modernization, when you're doing digitization, but you're onboarding capabilities that are often untested, often unprecedented, very exciting, but also paralyzing for that reason, you're in this double bind as a leader. Do you, if you're CTO, are you in a position to actually mandate the blanket adoption of some technology that, you know, for example, may or may not be put out of date by some Chinese startup in the next few months? Are you going to risk vendor lock-in? even if you do those things, are you going to do it in a way that you think your constituents, your stakeholders, the people who want your consumers or your citizens, if you're a government entity, are they actually something that's going to stand behind this new chatbot or this new workflow if it's external facing? There's a lot of uncertainty there. And the vision for the company, which the name of it is Hortus AI, that's the Latin word for guarding, was really to embrace that challenge by creating infrastructure and workflows so that organizations that need to be responsive to their own stakeholders and constituents not only can be, even as they onboard AI technology, but that actually that feedback itself can be used to augment the integration. So what we're basically creating, and is a pipeline to make it so that feedback from constituents, from the people for whom your organization nominally exists, are themselves actively rather than just passively informing what adoption looks like. And so I think this checks off several boxes that make a significant contribution to the landscape. And unfortunately, this is not to get political, but what we've seen in the last few weeks is the Wild West culture of development that has defined, certainly our previous episodes, but really everything since ChatGPT is not going to go away anytime soon at the federal level or at the geopolitical level. And so there needs to be some other basis for what leadership means. And so as a private sector startup company, we are going to be making contributions and hopefully helping government, education, healthcare meet the mandate of serving their own constituents better by means of a technology that should really be harnessed for public good. And so we're really just, I think, meeting a challenge that is something that we've been circling in a lot of these conversations, which is what are the guiding principles for AI development, if any? Is it just alchemy? Is there something else to it? If not, actually, does that matter? And for us, and I've said this before, really what I have been manifesting is alchemy for good. That's in a nutshell the brand of the company is embrace, frankly, the spiritual, embrace the unknown, embrace the ability to find human questions and problems at the heart of a technology that is itself deeply, in some ways, inhuman and not inherently sensitive to human feeling, human cognition. I don't buy a lot of the analogies between large language models and the makeup of the human brain, but I think that there's enormous potential for this infrastructure to help human purposes be rearticulated. And so it's really that notion of purposiveness of goal that I think we're trying to create organizationally for government and for companies that really want to integrate this stuff in ways that help them live up to their own mandates better and not just extract more efficiency.
Okay, I think my role here is going to be taking the abstract goal and trying to make it tangible for what this means to people. There's a lot of high-level directions or directions to take this, which is what are basic things like who is a user and what does a constituent actually mean with respect to AI. I think it could be fun to ground in a specific example that everybody knows to get this going. And for example, what does it do with a user's respect to AI in one of these sectors that's not just direct to consumer, like consumer chatbot? So something more specialized than ChatGPT, which could be a local government has their own reference documents or something. And how does something like DeepSeek, where it shows the reasoning chain of thought, changing the user experience, is this something that fits into the modality of this empowers the user, not because it's actually changing what the output is substantially, but it changes the relationship to the AI where they feel like they are more engaged with the subject matter? Is this in scope for sorts of recommendations that you could make, which is that you're not necessarily giving them a better model, but you're giving them something that could be a better experience so where people understand AI.
Certainly a more active experience. Yeah. There's this distinction between passive and active feedback, for example, that can be used as the basis for, it could be pre-training or it could even be relevant for fine-tuning as well, where basically are you looking, if you're trying to build an AI application that is optimal in some sense, where do you look to find the criteria for that? On what metrics are in scope there, right? Do you look to see how the behaviors of people when they interact with this tool are shifting? Or, that's one whole world of data analytics. And, you can think about recommender systems, for example, this way, because they're often almost exclusively optimized based off of passive feedback on TikTok or Twitter or things like that. Metrics like linger would be a good example of the ultimate, the most passive possible metric.
Would be easy to do with language models too.
Yeah.
People haven't done it yet, probably because the growth is continuing. They don't need to. Character AI has probably done that, which is maximized for conversation time, which is a scary thing and probably not going to detour the whole conversation there. We've talked about that.
So that's one whole world. There's another perspective on this, which is if you're trying to build AI for good, or you're trying to integrate it in ways people want, naively, you could just ask people, what would be a good functionality for this agent or this interface or this system? And then people will say things. They may not say things that are intelligible. They may not say things that immediately fit a clear product insertion point or a clear, specific product feature that could be easily operationalized, but they are at least actively articulating what it is that is at stake for them in the activity that this AI application would inherit or intervene upon. And so really, one way to begin grounding this is to say, what we're building at Hortus AI is infrastructure for observability of performance but where that observability is informed both by, yes, how is consumer behavior or constituent behavior shifting as this AI application is being deployed, but then also looking to see what in that behavior or what is it that constituents are saying when the users are saying to you or through some interface when they're using this about what they would like this to do. And actually actively integrating that into the product roadmap is a lot of what we're helping. And so we're kind of filling this gap between, larger AI vendors who are deploying really whatever they want for the sake of deploying it and expecting, for example, the public sector to kind of pick up the scraps from that. And instead saying there could be a different equilibrium here where the terms of engagement are, we will go with the vendor or we will go with a solution that conforms to the criteria for capabilities and performance that our own constituents are telling us they want. And what we're doing is making that into something that can actually be a guide for integration. Because it's easy to say this, but it's often not said, I think, in our previous conversations on this podcast. I think I should say it now. There's the AI world of people who really do keep track, like we basically do, of every week some new model or some new frontier application. And then there's the fact that there's still an enormous number, hundreds of government agencies in America whose legacy systems run on Fortran, or that are just entirely offline, who are completely alienated and just completely behind any of these recent developments, but who have the mandate to build systems and operate them that are meant to be representing the interests of their constituents in a way that's different than just the consumer relationship.
I think we should try to.
And so that's the kind of world.
We should make this more specific. What is the stack of interventions that you actually use? Is this is this a model where they agree to have you help them figure out what tools to sign up for? Are you actually modifying how the AI is going to be deployed through any combination of system prompt, fine tuning, data store, blah, 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 to make it better suited to their metric. There's a lot of ways to approach this, and I don't know which ones are most tractable in the short term and most impactful in the long term.
Well, in our case, there's a few different insertion points for what we're doing. So one is, imagine you're a city and you're the CIO or CTO of that city, which is actually a rapidly growing role, even for medium-sized or small-sized cities in the United States. And you've been given a mandate to take some workflows across, like, your local transportation department, your local sanitation department, your local, name your other application, your teams. And you need to say, like, okay, we're looking for a way that a chatbot could be used internally by this team to more quickly and more efficiently produce, could be marketing resources for citizens, could be developing policy, could be just updating the way in which we go about checking our own systems, what have you. And what you're doing then, if you've been given this mandate as a CTO, you're going to look to see what vendors are even approximately in a position to be able to sell you something that you could trust on that basis to actually like do some of those things for you. What we see is a rapidly growing number of options there. Obviously you've got your Googles, your Amazons, your Microsofts, but you've also got Deloitte's, Accenture's, Boston consulting groups, who themselves will sell you not just a product, but really a soup to nuts integration.
Yeah.
Where they're just
really
come
do.
in.
Deloitte, et cetera, are making or have made a remarkable amount of money off of this initial AI boom. I don't think that they're placed to take the long tail of it. And I will ask you later some like longer term questions on how this changes. But people need to understand how much money these consulting companies are taking by just having somebody come and say they want AI and fine tuning a llama model on their data and being like, here you go, with a huge markup. I don't think that these are necessarily long-term solutions, and it's a market dynamic that shouldn't be surprising. But I would guess that it's mostly box checking, and I don't know if you intend to be a middleman there or an advisor, at least to start.
Well, I guess I'm just painting a picture of like, how does the market currently actually operate?
Yeah.
If we just suspend like how excited we may or may not be about where AI may or may not be in 5 years. So we actually just look at the market dynamic as it currently exists. And yeah, frankly, as I think it's likely to continue to exist by default, is you've either got a very small number of frontier model or agent providers who promise you the world in terms of capabilities, but really are often not able to articulate or explain those things in ways that prepare these legacy entities, whether that's government, whether that's healthcare, whether that's education. They do not actually meaningfully prepare those things to go about integrating those capabilities in anything like a coherent way. Then on the other hand, you've got these bespoke data-driven consultancy outfits, which make you pay through the nose for, often, as you said, something that they really don't do that much special or involved work on, but then at least promises the ability for this thing to be deployed to your organization in ways that you don't have to worry about. And, where we're coming into saying, like, really what is at stake here is the question, what is it that you as an organization are trying to optimize for? Are you trying to optimize for the fastest possible deployment? That's one path. Are you trying to optimize for a completely bespoke solution that consultants make for you? Or are you trying to optimize for what I would call an augmented end user experience, where the end user could be a citizen, it could be a student, it could be a teacher, it could be a doctor, or it could be a patient, right? I mean, like whatever the profiles are there. And then the question is, what is that ideal end user experience? And how do you go about targeting that organizationally in ways that these new capabilities will get you there? And so in our early days, we are working with a few different cities across the country now to do this. We are very hands-on, helping people understand, here's basically where you are in your workflow. Here's what KPIs or metrics matter most to you. Here's how you go about targeting things. And so in that regard,
Can you give
in
an
the early
example of
days,
what a KPI would look like for a municipality or a like similar type of
well, yeah, I
organization? I think
could.
it's easy to see it for a tech company or a like a business analyst or a finance company, but a part of that could be the challenge is what is AI providing to these public sector entities?
In the case of the public sector, I can describe this in terms of what we're seeing of like across different use cases entail different user experiences. Here's what I mean by that. If you are, let's imagine you're a city and you eventually want to do something crazy like automating almost all of the interactions that your citizens or stakeholders have with public services. Okay, so instead of like spending a half hour on hold with some like healthcare service worker, or like I'm trying to register to vote, I just moved here, but I don't understand. Or I got a parking ticket and I'd like to contest it, but I have no idea what the procedure for doing that is. Instead of having this onerous, largely offline and largely just like unknown process by which you can get that information from a human, imagine there was some kind of like, perplexity for Chicago or something else that, and maybe it's fine tuned or whatever. But the point is that that's basically the primary interface through which you request anything and also through which you get anything. Now, that's, I think, in some ways very exciting. And it's kind of like it's in that the dream there would be you sort of turn the city, you turn a polity basically into an API where you just call things and then they're just brought up for you in a completely seamless and efficient manner. However, in practice, different kinds of requests and different kinds of public services entail very different experiences in terms of even what a good experience would be. So, for example, if I literally just need to know, I need to put my trash out, but I'm going to have to do it on or immediately after the 4th of July. So how do I know when or how trash will get picked up in my neighborhood, like on that date? Like you just basically need very up-to-date information that's accurate. That the dream scenario could be something like you send in a very specific prompt and you get a very specific answer. It's one and done. And so the dream there would be something like the dream would be like the Google I'm feeling lucky approach to integration, where my goal as a citizen is to spend as little time in this interface as possible and just get the most accurate information I can about the one thing I'm looking for. That's one tail.
That
Very
seems very
different.
similar to most information retrieval out there or a lot of uses of AI. I mean, any Google related thing. And I'm guessing people still use Google for these federal or these public sector ideas. I personally start like making an LLC. I know that a lot of the things are not easy to find and they're concentrated on some websites, and Stripe like makes a platform for them. But the Washington like Secretary of State website is still a thing that you have to go through, and I find a lot of these through Google. That's not necessarily most of the uses. That's a very that sort of thing is a minority of the like types of queries looking for government information, but that's not too different. But it's mostly the relation. Like I don't know if it's the relationship or expectations from that type of information relative to something like Perplexity. It's like why I still use AI models for some of this because I know they're good at parsing information. So I've gone to ChatGPT or something like this, and maybe I'm not the right user. So maybe that's something to say which is that this company is not about improving the relationship for people who are very AI first, but it's about improving these relationships for everybody who are not like trying to find out what works and what doesn't and just have default forms of adoption.
I mean, the tagline here for Hortus is a populist approach to AI adoption and integration. And, by populist, that's what I mean. Populist as opposed to as opposed to literally elites, which frankly, that's what you and I
Yeah.
and other people who maybe often listen to this
God, the
podcast
democratizing
are,
thing
or
never goes away. There's a lot of
proximate
comments
to
on
them.
democratizing RL or AI right now, and I'm like, oh my god,
Yeah,
we're not going down this rabbit hole right now, but it's happening again.
we're not. And I've deliberately, that's very much not the company, like Hortus branding. That might be a different conversation though, exactly what that implies, but that's really not what I'm getting at here. I mean, to give the other example I was building towards, there's the I'm feeling lucky approach of experience on the one end, but then on the other end, there's, you know, there's different names for it, but there's basically something like the community portal approach. So like, I don't know how many like loyal users of Wikipedia we may have on this pod, but basically Wikipedia does have what they call a community portal, where it's really just meant to be an interface to orient editors and contributors of Wikipedia to any number of things that they could do in order to, in some sense, improve the operation of Wikipedia. That could be creating a new article, editing existing content, contributing to a discussion page. Like there's lots of stuff, right? And
Another
so
aside,
often,
but have you seen that some AI people have been coming out as Wikipedia as a bad source and something that we don't want to replicate in the last few weeks? I was also aghast to
not
this. I was
surprising.
like, are you kidding me? Like, Wikipedia is not the problem here. Just because something is community driven does not mean that it's reducing to extremely biased information. I think it's an extreme. Is it probably a classic SF tech bubble thing to see somehow reframe Wikipedia as a quote unquote enemy, even though they're likely to be one of the most neutral entities and reliable entities out there? We will see how the relationship with information changes with AI, but Wikipedia as an established brand will only become more important as a like source of a truth. As we know, there are many ways to represent different true facts and theories around them. But to go against Wikipedia, it was so shocking to me.
I mean, I'm personally a fan of it and what it represents, but I think my point is really just more that the kind of experience that Wikipedia promises for its users and that it allows its users to become part of by using Wikipedia is very different than the Google experience. And I think maybe often as AI folks who are very close to the technology, we don't often qualitatively think about that, like how radically different those experiences are, not incidentally, but as a fact of the matter, that like there are different values at stake in those different kinds of experiences, because one relationship is defined, frankly, basically through solidarity, like with other, in that case, editors or contributors, and the other isn't. You know, other users of Google are incidental to whether or not, you know, I'm able to search in one thing, get the result that I'm looking for as a consumer. Now, in practice, especially I think with the public sector, different use cases cut across both of those things, and also lots of other types of user experiences. Because some prompts, I mean, even to borrow from your example, imagine you're starting a small business in, again, to take the example of Chicago. Literally speaking, there's any number of tasks you would need to fulfill or would need to be fulfilled in order for you to legally set that up, in order for you to, like, you know, get a lease if it's going to have an offline presence, in order for you to hire people, in order for you to get things going. But often when you're an entrepreneur and you're just starting out, what you're really looking for is just orientation. Who should I be speaking to? Where are events happening? What conversations matter for me as I get this off the ground? And so it's not the same kind of situation where you're just prompting for a specific type of information and just want the most accurate response. If you're talking about a chatbot interface, what you're really looking for is onboarding. What you're really looking for is being given the kind of social ties and infrastructure and orientation that you would need for your venture, your endeavor, to be seen as recognizably worthwhile by the people that you're going to be wanting to either sell to or to be in cahoots with. And so there's any number of public resources, or what are often called like community benefit organizations or CBOs, that exist in order to facilitate this in cities or in neighborhoods or in, you know, and imagine just how many nonprofits exist in a city the size of Chicago, whose purpose is to help represent some constituent interest, some constituent set of values that could be identity based or neighborhood based, or, have some other kind of local dimension to it of meaning that otherwise would just be left behind if you're integrating a blanket kind of chatbot solution that is really just optimizing for accuracy alone. Because effectively what that could do, if there's any other criteria for showing things to people, is price out dozens or hundreds of potential stakeholder groups that otherwise could be a part of what really
What
needs to
does
be a
price out
coordinate.
mean here? If like wouldn't
Well,
the
what I
public
just
wouldn't Chicago be serving it so it's free to users?
Oh, well, yes. That's not what I meant. I meant that literally in more of an attention economy type sense. So the service could be free. Access to this interface could be free. But if the way in which that interface has been built and integrated to operate favors certain kinds of outputs and certain kinds of workflows over others, that's a as we say, a value sensitive decision that does not obviously serve the interests not only of the city, but even of the people who are trying to get information. So often what you may see is a degradation in trust of that chatbot, for example, if it's not able to reliably give people the type of information flow that they're really trying to get from their prompts. And so what that boils down to in that case is that the core metric really isn't accuracy, or at least not accuracy alone. It's things like relevance. It's things like, I already mentioned solidarity. We'd have to break down what that means in terms of what these outputs could look like. But the point is, it's really just meant to facilitate an ongoing relationship with the user rather than be something the user opens once, prompts once, gets their response, and then closes. It's much more relationship dependent than that. And so really I think where this fits into the broader vision for what, Hortus AI is doing is basically asking, what kind of relationship do agencies or cities want to have with their constituents once this integration is complete? What kinds of relationships do they want to grow? What kinds of relationships do they want to remake? Which ones do they want to cultivate? And have that be an active object of pursuit rather than incidental to the way in which AI is being onboarded to these workflows.
Do you think people have an appetite for this until they have failure? I can see many people that do not know what AI actually is to see the upside without the downside. This is not a failure that's hard to imagine, nor a failure that I think is particularly damning of the individual who does it. I think it's a failure that's hard to see.
It's a great question. What history seems to tell us often is that this type of question, these types of stakes are not something that are clear to people until, frankly, lives are on the line. That's what's true in the history of public health, for example. That's which I brought up before here. Why did public health become a field? Frankly, and to be blunt, it wasn't because things were going well. It's not like there was always this ambition to look after the well-being and populations of people, and suddenly technology just got good enough that we could get a lot better at doing that. What happened was, like, vast numbers, thousands of people would become infected, and many of them would die, often overnight, due to contagions that were increasingly clear were preventable through some change in policy, either on the part of the government or private sector. It didn't matter. The point was you had to have populations of people who realized or began to experience themselves as downstream of preventable impacts that they then had a material stake in changing and advocating for. And so, honestly, I think a critical dimension of this is that people are beginning now to experience, and we're seeing these dots be connected now, that these impacts are often preventable or could be different if there were a different set of criteria and strategies for how we'd go about integrating chatbots, Gen AI applications into aspects of our lives. Because it needs to be said, like our white paper actually does articulate this. And so if people want to read it, like the white paper will be live by the time this episode is. And so people can look at the full argument there. Basically, what we analogize there provocatively, and yeah, Nate, I don't know if you and I have discussed this in so many words, is that like, I think it's a fair analogy to say, um, we're basically the environment right now. Most people, we're the environment, and we're being explored by a handful of very small, very dominant tech players who deploy more or less whatever they want to see more or less whatever we're willing to play with for how long and what ways, which is then very useful signal for them to iterate and refine and build the next set of capabilities to deploy those. That seems to me, and I think seems to most people, like a doom loop that could be structured differently if there were different feedback loops at stake and different criteria used to determine what the responsibilities of those companies are. Where instead of building whatever they want, deploying them, and then looking for signal from our behavior, they're instead building things and deploying based off of what a real sense is of what people want to use or not want to use. And it's remarkable. Other markets work like this. Like most mature markets work like this, where, cars that are built are ones that the companies have good reason to think will sell well because they're things that people want. And it's remarkable the degree to which that's not how AI is built today. It could be built that way, but the incentives are real wonky right now. And so that's very much, I think, that uncertainty is what I think needs to be resolved. And I want to resolve it in a way that meets some collective public interests and population well-being.
I think I definitely have forms of agreeing. I think the saying that we are the environment is somewhat of a reduction, or it's not actually just specific to AI. I think ever since we tried to automate, it's all downstream of the internet becoming effectively the world that we live in. I think the digital world is effectively reality, and it's not fun to accept, but I think it's kind of something where we're at. And then as we have more powerful digital tools and manipulation of our lives, like, yes, we are part of this environment. I think it will be very interesting to see how these new forms of AI that are less direct interaction and more background interaction, for example, O1 Pro and Deep Research are becoming like this, where it takes 3 to 30 minutes for them to answer your question. It's asynchronous. And or is that asynchronous, but it's not expected to be a zero latency experience. And as they become more integrated in the world or have actions like email and things, then the environment again is going to be redefined. And we are very much part of this environment, and we are changed by this. But even going to this car example ends up being, you could draw similar conclusions with cars, which has to do with marketing and what people like. And we have always been the part of the environment of what is happening in technological capitalism. Like, humans are a part of what is being optimized for. I don't think this restricts the takeaway, which is how we have to be intentional about it, because I think these digital environments amplify a lot of the stakes and manipulate variables that people are far less comfortable with being manipulated. I think personally, I don't really mind if I get drawn to a certain brand of car based on their decisions. It's like, oh, I like Rivian. They're a counterpoint to Tesla, who I think does some manipulative things with their autonomy claims. It's like, okay, like, sure, I'll be a Rivian fan, and I don't even own a Rivian. It's like, whatever. And that type of thing is very different than manipulating my information diet completely through a specific funnel. And
The stakes are different.
I think that trying to communicate this nuance will be useful, but I also don't want it to just drop on people like, you are now the environment for the first time in your life. It's kind of been a gradual stakes are rising through social media in the 2000s and 2010s, where people started to realize the saying, where if you're not the product, or if it's whatever the saying is, where it's like, if the product is free, you're the product, or you're the payment. That is a transition point which we have gone through and continue to amplify. So trying to draw this line from marketing to retail and physical goods through social media and monetizing free use at scale to now, and what is different, like what is the defining lens of how AI is an amplification of this, I would think is one of the most important questions to answer.
I think you said it. I think it's that the stakes are higher. I think it's that the stakes, I would even say the stakes are life and death. I think that's what they actually are. And I think that's what's been tragic, is that we've all increasingly felt that the stakes are existential. Certainly, we've discussed the ways in which certain communities like safety have really run with that, rather than, I think, just sitting with that brutality of that fact, which is the stakes are existential, whether or not we're all going to die, literally or not. We will become a completely different, the way in which we live together, the way in which we live individually is completely going to change due to these capabilities. And so we do need to approach that question with intent. And the reason is not just because that's the right thing to do. The reason is that if we don't do that, then we are going to become completely contorted or deformed by these technologies because they are so powerful. And I do think that is the element that's different than certain cars and other sorts of just, easily, material technologies that maybe just make certain kinds of living more efficient or more convenient, but otherwise don't really change my sense of identity or my sense of self. That being said, I have been reading, I may have brought this up before on the podcast. I've been actually now close to finally finishing The Power Broker, which is about Robert Moses, this urban planner in New York City. And I think that book has a lot of interesting lessons in it about power and the relationship to technology that power has and how easily contorted that can become. And what really stands out to me about that story is that if you were living in New York City in the 1930s or 1940s and highways were being put up everywhere, it was pretty obvious that that wasn't going to work without a corresponding commitment to mass transit. The reason being, if you just create highways and make it so that every single person, or at least every single person of some means, every single middle-class person could afford a car, there was simply not enough physical space on highways to accommodate that number of vehicles. And there was, I'm just describing the tragedy of the commons, basically. That was inevitable in light of that commitment. And the reason that perspective, which really was obvious if you were a commuter, because you could then see from 1920 to 1930 how your commute into Manhattan went from maybe 30 minutes to 3 hours. It was obvious that something structurally was wrong. And people really were not given avenues to express that realization. In other words, you had a reality that was increasingly obvious to lay people about this infrastructural failure that Robert Moses was shoving down their throats. But because he frankly had the backing of the major newspapers in New York, the other outlets at the time, public policy planners, the mayor basically answered to Moses. There really was no one, there was no other loudspeaker. There was no other voice that was able to even question the inevitability of this rollout of highways. And the result was, and this is really what the book is about, New York committed itself to a vision that ended up hurting basically everybody who needed to go commuting anywhere. And my concern now is that we need something like that for this moment, where the stakes are not just the fact that, cars have a certain kind of capacity and that if, without some other kind of mass transit commitment, there's going to be no way to keep these through lines efficient if you're trying to get in and out of the city. Now the question is, when everyone has their own AI agent, or you have entire organizations that are effectively staffed by mostly or entirely AI capabilities, how can we even possibly keep a pace, keep abreast, and stay oriented to what we want and what we don't want in a world where we're inundated with that type of disruption. The stakes are higher and they're faster, and that for me adds a sense of urgency to this question. And so, what most concerns me is not the technology or anything like that. I think what most concerns me is the fact that there need to be countervailing visions of how to integrate it in ways that provide and protect space for active feedback and intention in how this integration proceeds. Because otherwise, we are just grist for the mill.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to one of the kind of original questions of this podcast. Why is it better to do it from an independent organization as Hortus than to work at OpenAI or one of these companies and be a voice from the inside about the role of landing products in this kind of user experience?
You and I remember when OpenAI was founded. I believe I've mentioned the version of this anecdote before. When was that? 2015?
A little while ago.
So it's like coming up. It's like coming up on its 10th anniversary, its birthday. Yeah, I mean, that company began as a nonprofit. It began with the best of intentions. They had their charter. I encourage people to go. I'm sure it's still online somewhere. You can find a, archived version of it. The culture of that company has completely and unequivocally shifted now due to the ecosystem that we now live in, especially post ChatGPT. The race that we're in, whether you want to call it a Cold War or not, like whatever, however you want to call it, the craziness, and what it's been for the last 2 years or so. What does that tell me? What it tells me is the companies that are building these technologies, or even trying to oversee them, or even trying to inform what it means to integrate them or not, are only as good as what they're committed to. It's really not a question of do they have the best programmers, or do they have the tightest product feedback loop, or are they in a better position to move or iterate on existing capabilities. If you believe that, then yeah, you probably should go work for OpenAI. And we'll see how long they can keep you on for, how long you'll keep being willing to work there. But in practice, every company that's really trying to intervene in this space is going to face any number of existential moments where it has to ask itself, what actually are we committed to? Are we committed to moving product as fast as possible? Because if that's what you're committed to, I can tell you what kind of company you're going to become like a month or two down the road. Or are you committed to literally anything else? Because whatever the answer to those questions is, that's going to determine who your customers are. It's going to determine how it feels to wake up in the morning and work there. It's going to determine actually whether what may or may not have been in your charter originally is still reflected organizationally in terms of what you're building, and in terms of what you intend to build in the future and how you intend to build it. You have to defend those things. I've personally found in my career, if that's the direction of your question, like, what do you individually, if you care about these things, which wagon should you hitch yourself to? What I've found to be the most significant moments in my career in this AI world are the moments when I said no to something. I was invited to co-author a paper or co-organize a workshop or speak at something, or I was offered some kind of position. And I was like, no, this doesn't work for me. Those were the most significant moments, I think, for me, and I think for the other person or entity that was providing it. And the reason is, it's really in a world that's growing as quickly as this one has been, and frankly, it looks like we'll continue to, saying yes is easy because you're almost always riding an exponential curve of some kind or another. Like if you're living in the Bay or like, somewhere else and like you're surrounded by hotspots, you can just ride whatever rocket you want and probably end up somewhere different. But when you're saying no, what you're really indicating is there's just some other North Star that I'm more committed to even the idea of than whatever this thing is you're dropping into my lap and expecting me, to see like, hey, we'll pay you 6 figures to do this thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would summarize this as mostly whether you like it or not, you can only really do one thing at once in very high impact. And if that thing is training models, the entire culture is about landing these models. And the subtleties between Anthropic and OpenAI are always fun to revisit, but they're not customer-oriented organizations, whether or not they want to say that they are. And you can look at my example, which is I've very much branded as a open source person. I don't think I'm an absolutist, but it's the thing that I'm trying to make a difference on right now. And it's very co-aligned with what AI2 is doing. And I still think it's very useful, even though there are other issues to work on and prioritize. Just practically, I can have way more influence by choosing this thing to be the thing. And it's very hard for most of these organizations with the amount of money that they have to make it a certain like minority, not like minority in the demographic sense, but minority in the number sense, users of their products secondhand. It's not something that they can hill climb on. It therefore is very not actionable. So therefore, easily having different organizations can make sense.
I mean, I think that's right. I am committed, and Hortus AI is committed, although AI is in the name, and there's reasons for that. But we're not committed to AI for AI's sake. We're not. We're committed to users. We're committed to the user experience. We're committed to doing justice to the experiences that users want to have with this technology, much more than we are to whatever intrinsic alchemical process may unfold from the technology itself, which it's such a simple thing to say, but like that sets us apart from a lot of other companies just in the way that I said that. And there's a lot in terms of product, in terms of workflow, in terms of customers, and in terms of culture that immediately follows from that. So I would encourage our listeners to really reflect on like, really, what are you building for? What do you want to build for and why? And the clearer you get about that, that's going to immediately clarify who it makes sense for you to even apply for jobs to, let alone what you may or may want to start yourself.
Makes it a lot easier to say no to things. I can only say the amount of things I say no to is ridiculously high. I unfortunately now have to say no by not responding sometimes. I'm well past the point of actually saying no to everybody. But as you become better aligned and clearer on what your goals are, it's really obvious what to say no to, and what actually shifts the needle in terms of impact.
Everyone ends up saying no to something at some point. Yeah. And so is that principled, or is that is it something that just arbitrarily happens as your career moves along? It's pretty important to try to maintain the former.
Yeah. Should we on rambling longer?
Yeah, I think I should get back to manifesting this vision and starting this company. But yeah, it's been good to catch up. Maybe I don't always get as much of a chance to catch up anymore as you used to. So it's been good. So we can do that too. But yeah, it's been a pleasure, and people are welcome to, we can maybe put this stuff in the show notes, but put some resources there if you'll learn about our updates as we continue to roll things out.
Yeah.
And stay in touch.
I'll be closer in touch about show note writing for this one than the normal fast process. So we'll get this to you at the right time, and there'll probably be more announcements that you'll hear from Tom. And thanks for listening, and catch you all later.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.